What would you do if everything you sacrificed your life for was suddenly worth nothing? Daniel stared at the worn-out medals in his hands, his last piece of dignity. They weren't just metal, they were his blood, sweat, and years of service. But now they were all he had left, and he was about to sell them. When the pawn shop cashier smirked and offered him $50, Daniel felt his heart sink. $50. That's what his years of sacrifice were worth. Then the door swung open. A towering figure stepped inside, his eyes locking onto the counter. The room fell silent. Shaquille O'Neal had just walked in, and what happened next would change Daniel's life forever. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Daniel's fingers tremble as he unzips an old worn-out case, revealing a collection of gleaming military medals. Each one tells a story of sacrifice, of blood, sweat, and moments where he faced death and survived. But today they aren't just memories. They're his last hope. The dim light in his apartment flickers, casting long shadows on the cracked walls. An old final notice eviction letter sits on the table, staring back at him like an unrelenting executioner. Pay $1,500 by Friday or vacate immediately. His hands tighten around the box. He has no one left to call, no savings, no backup plan. For decades, these medals were his proof that his sacrifices meant something, that his years of service, his pain, and his lost brothers in arms were not forgotten. But now, they're just metal. And if metal can keep a roof over his head for another month, then so be it. His leg aches as he slowly stands, his worn-out cane groaning under his weight. The battlefield injury from years ago never healed right, but there was no point in complaining. The world had long since moved on, leaving men like him in the dust. Daniel limps to the tiny bathroom mirror, his tired, weathered face staring back at him. His once sharp blue eyes are dull, his gray hair unkempt. The man who once stood tall in uniform now looks like a stranger. I never thought it would come to this. The words slip from his lips, barely above a whisper. He pulls on his old army jacket, one of the last things he still owns from those days. Faded, tattered at the edges, but still his. Then carefully he tucks the shoebox of medals under his arm. A cold gust of air hits him as he steps outside, the city's neon lights flickering in the distance. With one last glance at his empty apartment, Daniel limps toward the pawn shop, gripping his past in his hands, unaware that fate is about to change everything. The scent of rusted metal and old leather fills Daniel's nose as he steps into the pawn shop. The place is dimly lit, cluttered with relics of lost hope, guitars that once played love songs, wedding rings that no longer fit, and forgotten treasures waiting for new hands. At the counter, a young cashier barely glances up, tapping on his phone. The dull blue glow of the screen reflects in his uninterested eyes. Daniel tightens his grip on the shoebox, his knuckles pale. A faint bell jingles as the door swings shut behind him. A few customers browse the shelves, running fingers over old pocket watches and dusty baseball cards. Daniel limps forward, his cane clicking against the worn tile floor. He places the shoebox down gently, almost reverently, as if setting down something sacred. The cashier finally looks up, raising an eyebrow at the old man's trembling hands. Need something? The kid's voice is flat, uninterested. Daniel swallows the lump in his throat. Yeah, he rasps. I want to sell these. He lifts the lid, revealing his entire life's worth of medals. The silver and bronze shine faintly under the dim lights. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, campaign ribbons, and commendation medals. Each one earned through sweat, pain, and moments where he didn't think he'd survive. The cashier frowns and leans forward slightly. You're selling these? Daniel nods stiffly. Need to make rent. The kid snorts. Man, that's rough. He reaches out and lifts one of the medals, turning it over between his fingers. They give these to a lot of guys? Daniel's jaw tightens. Not for nothing. The cashier shrugs. Guess that depends on who you ask. He tosses the medal back into the box carelessly, making Daniel flinch. The kid taps on the counter, finally showing some interest. Let me be real with you, old man. These ain't gold, ain't silver, just some old metal. They don't mean much to people who ain't got 'em. Daniel stares at him, disbelief washing over his face. So, what are you offering? He asks, his voice barely above a whisper. The cashier sighs, rubbing his chin, then leans back against his chair. $50, he says with a smirk. Daniel's fingers tighten around the edge of the counter. $50. His sacrifice, his pain, his service. All reduced to a crumpled bill and some loose change. His throat burns as he forces himself to speak. You think that's all they're worth? The cashier shrugs. I mean, yeah. What else am I supposed to give you for 'em? A heavy silence fills the room. Then, the bell above the door chimes. The cashier glances up, then freezes. Daniel follows his gaze and feels the air shift. Standing in the doorway, a massive figure steps inside. Shaquille O'Neal just walked into the pawn shop. Daniel stares at the medals, symbols of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. $50. That's what his service is worth? The dull hum of the pawn shop's flickering fluorescent lights did nothing to drown out the ache in Daniel's chest. He stood at the counter, his rough, calloused hands resting on the small box of medals. They weren't just metal and ribbon. They were his youth, his sacrifice, the nights he had spent under enemy fire, the days he had spent watching his brothers fall beside him. And now they were worth $50. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he stared at the cashier. The young man, no older than 25, barely looked up from his phone. His gums smacked loudly as he leaned on the counter. So, you gonna take it or what? Daniel let out a slow breath, gripping his cane tighter to keep himself steady. These medals mean something, he said, his voice firm but restrained. The cashier sighed, finally setting his phone down and glancing at the box as if it were a pile of rusted junk. Not to me, he muttered, shrugging. They ain't gold. They ain't silver. Ain't worth much to anyone, really. Daniel's jaw clenched. Not worth much. The words hit harder than any bullet he'd ever faced. A customer browsing the shelves of old electronics and dusty watches turned his head at the conversation. A middle-aged woman at the jewelry display frowned, shifting uncomfortably as she overheard the exchange. Daniel took a deep breath. He had been through worse. He had stood his ground on foreign soil, faced enemies who wanted him dead, and survived. He wasn't about to lose his temper over some kid who had no idea what those medals represented. But still, the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled eviction notice. He had no choice. He needed the money, even if it meant parting with the only physical proof of his sacrifices. $50, the cashier repeated, leaning back against the counter, unimpressed. Take it or leave it. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose. His pride was screaming at him to walk away, but the thought of losing his apartment, the only place he had left, kept him rooted to the spot. He nodded stiffly. Fine. The cashier smirked, reaching for the box. But before he could take it, the door to the pawn shop swung open, and a massive figure stepped inside. The atmosphere in the shop shifted instantly. A few heads turned toward the door. The cashier paused, his expression flickering with confusion. The middle-aged woman's mouth fell open slightly. Daniel furrowed his brows and turned to look. A shadow cast itself over the dimly lit store, stretching across the tiled floor like an unspoken presence. A towering man, broad-shouldered and unmistakable, stepped inside. His sheer size alone made him impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just his stature. It was the aura, the presence that came with him. People started whispering. Is that? No way. The cashier sat up straight for the first time since Daniel had entered. Daniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He had seen a lot of things in his lifetime, things most people couldn't even imagine, but he never thought he'd be standing in the same room as Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq's eyes swept across the pawn shop, his gaze locking onto the counter, more specifically onto the small box of medals sitting on top of it. He took a step closer, his voice deep and calm but carrying undeniable authority. What's going on here? The cashier gulped. Daniel swallowed, still gripping his cane. For the first time that day, he didn't feel small. Shaq's eyes immediately lock onto the medals sitting on the counter. His expression shifts. What started as casual curiosity turns into something deeper, something serious. The air inside the pawn shop had already been thick with tension, but now it felt heavier. The cashier, who had been so dismissive just moments ago, suddenly seemed much smaller under Shaq's towering presence. Daniel, gripping his cane tightly, felt a mixture of relief and humiliation wash over him. He hadn't asked for attention, especially not from someone like Shaquille O'Neal. But now there was no ignoring it. Shaq took a step closer, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the counter. His deep voice rumbled through the tiny shop. "What's going on here?" The cashier rolled his eyes, trying to act unfazed, but there was an undeniable nervous edge to his voice now. "This guy's trying to sell his medals," the cashier said with a smirk, nudging the small box towards Shaq as if it were a pile of junk. $50. Shaq's face darkened, his brow furrowed as he glanced at Daniel, then back at the medals. He reached out, carefully lifting one from the box. It was a Purple Heart. Shaq ran a thumb over the surface, his eyes scanning the inscription. His expression turned unreadable, but something flashed in his gaze. Anger, respect, disbelief. Maybe all three. He set the medal down carefully, then looked at the cashier. 50? That's it? His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. The young man shrugged. "Like I told him, it's not gold, it's not silver. It's just an old medal." A scoff came from one of the customers behind them, an older woman clutching a vintage handbag. She muttered something under her breath, shaking her head. Shaq took another step forward, forcing the cashier to crane his neck to look up at him. "You got any idea what these are?" Shaq asked, his voice low. The cashier shrugged again, but now his cocky attitude was slipping. "I mean, yeah, they're like military awards, but it's not like—" Shaq didn't let him finish. "These aren't just military awards." Shaq's voice was firm now, commanding the attention of everyone in the shop. "This man earned these. These are for bravery, for sacrifice." The room had gone silent. Even the customers browsing the shelves had stopped pretending not to listen. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't wanted this. He didn't want people looking at him like a charity case. Shaq turned to him, his expression softening. "Why you selling these, man?" Daniel clenched his jaw, looking down at his worn shoes. The cane in his hand suddenly felt heavier. He didn't want to say it, but what choice did he have? "I got rent due," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "Disability checks don't cover it all." Shaq was quiet for a long moment. He studied Daniel, then glanced at the eviction notice peeking out of the old veteran's coat pocket. Finally, Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, this ain't right." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat and looked away, ashamed. He never thought he'd find himself in this position, standing in a pawn shop, letting strangers witness his lowest moment. "I don't have another choice," he said quietly. Shaq studied him for a second longer, then placed both hands on the counter, his massive palms pressing against the surface. And then, in a tone that sent a ripple through the entire shop, he said, "Yeah, you do." Daniel's eyes flickered up, confused. Shaq had a look in his eye, a look that said something big was about to happen. Shaq crosses his massive arms, his deep voice cutting through the silence of the pawn shop. "Hold up. Why you selling these, man?" The question hangs heavy in the air. Daniel shifts uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his cane. He doesn't want to answer. Not here. Not in front of all these people. But there's something about the way Shaq looks at him, patient but firm, that tells him this man isn't asking to embarrass him. He's asking because he truly wants to know. Daniel sighs, his shoulders slumping slightly. His pride is already in pieces. What's one more crack? "I got rent due," he mutters, eyes fixed on the counter. "Disability checks don't cover it all." Shaq doesn't react right away. Instead, he picks up one of the medals, turning it over in his giant hand, his thumb tracing the worn edges. His expression is unreadable, but his silence speaks volumes. Daniel swallows hard, feeling suddenly exposed. He forces himself to keep talking, even though every word feels like sandpaper against his throat. "I didn't want to do this," he says, voice barely above a whisper, "but I got no choice." Shaq finally looks up. His gaze is steady, unwavering. "How much is your rent?" Daniel hesitates. Saying the number out loud makes it feel worse somehow, like he's officially confirming his failure. He rubs his forehead, exhaling slowly. 1,500. The words feel like lead dropping into an already sinking boat. Shaq nods, absorbing the number. He sets the medal down gently, as if placing something sacred. Then, without a word, he reaches into his back pocket. A thick, well-worn leather wallet appears in his massive hands. The room is so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The cashier's smirk fades as Shaq pulls out a wad of cash. Crisp $100 bills stacked neatly, tucked between his fingers like playing cards. Daniel's eyes widen. Wait, what are you doing? Shaq doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he starts counting, his deep voice low and steady. 1, 2, 3. The other customers lean in, whispering amongst themselves. Someone pulls out a phone, already recording. The cashier watches with growing unease. This is not how things were supposed to go. 14. 15. Shaq stops. The money sits in his palm, an exact stack of $1,500. Without hesitation, he places it on the counter. Here. Daniel stares at the bills as if they might disappear if he blinks. Take it, Shaq says, his voice calm but firm. And keep your medals. Daniel doesn't move. His hands tremble at his sides. His throat tightens. I can't take this, he says hoarsely. Shaq just smiles. Yeah, you can. Daniel blinks back, the burning in his eyes, struggling to process what's happening. He spent the morning feeling like nothing, like a man whose sacrifices had been reduced to a price tag of $50. But now he wasn't just holding on to his medals. He was holding on to something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Dignity. And Shaq wasn't done yet. The air in the pawn shop shifts, heavy with disbelief. Conversations die mid-sentence. The low hum of fluorescent lights is the only sound left. Daniel stares at the thick stack of $100 bills resting on the counter, his breath catching in his throat. I can't take this. His voice is barely above a whisper, shaky and uncertain. But Shaq, he just smiles. That calm, unwavering smile that carries the weight of a man who's done this before. Yeah, you can, Shaq says, his deep voice gentle but firm. You earned it. Daniel's fingers tremble as they hover over the cash. He wants to reach for it, but something inside him won't let him. Pride, shame, disbelief. They all collide in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He swallows hard, his throat tight. I don't even know what to say. Shaq shrugs. You don't gotta say nothing. The customers in the shop begin murmuring, some pulling out their phones recording the moment. A woman near the jewelry case dabs at her eyes. A man in a worn-out leather jacket nods approvingly. Even the cashier, who had been so dismissive earlier, looks unsettled. He shifts his weight from foot to foot, rubbing the back of his neck. Man, I didn't think it was that serious, he mutters, almost as if trying to justify himself. Shaq's head snaps toward him, his eyes narrowing slightly. That's the problem, he says. You didn't think. The words land like a punch. The cashier has nothing to say. Daniel looks up at Shaq, his vision slightly blurred by unshed tears. Why? He asks, voice cracking. Why would you do this for me? For a second, Shaq doesn't answer. He just looks at Daniel. Really looks at him. At the tired eyes, the weathered hands, the medals once worn with pride, now almost lost to desperation. And then finally he speaks. Because respect is priceless. Daniel exhales shakily, his grip tightening on his cane. The pawn shop, once just another stop on his long road of struggles, has become something else entirely, a turning point. And he's not the only one who feels it, because outside the world is already watching. Daniel grips the counter, still struggling to process what just happened. His hands tremble over the stack of $100 bills, but the weight of Shaq's words lingers heavier than the money itself. Because respect is priceless. The words echo in the silent pawn shop. Shaq leans down slightly, leveling his gaze with Daniel's. There's no pity in his expression, just quiet understanding. You don't sell your honor, man. Not for $50. Not for any price. The room feels even smaller now, all eyes locked on them. The air is thick with emotion. Shaq reaches out and picks up one of the medals, turning it over in his massive hands. The light catches on the engraved words, for bravery and service. How many years? Shaq asks, his voice softer now. Daniel exhales slowly, still holding back tears. 26. Shaq lets out a low whistle. That's a lifetime, man. He places the medal back onto the counter, but this time he does it carefully, with reverence. The cashier clears his throat, suddenly uncomfortable under the weight of the moment. He shifts from foot to foot, glancing around as if looking for an escape. Look, he starts, but stops when another voice cuts through the room. This is what real appreciation looks like. A man near the back of the store steps forward, his weathered face marked with deep lines of experience. He wears a Vietnam veteran hat, his hands curled into fists at his sides. I fought too, the man says, nodding at Daniel. And let me tell you something. If more people were like him, he gestures toward Shaq, we wouldn't have so many forgotten soldiers out here. Murmurs of agreement ripple through the small crowd. A woman wipes at her eyes. Another customer, a younger man with tattoos peeking from beneath his sleeves, pulls out his phone and starts recording. Shaq notices but doesn't stop him. Some moments deserve to be seen. Daniel's breath shudders as he finally forces himself to speak. I was ready to walk out of here, with nothing but regret. His voice cracks slightly. And you reminded me what this all meant. Shaq places a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. You don't need reminding, Shaq tells him. The world does. Outside, traffic moves as usual, the world oblivious to what's unfolding. Inside the tiny pawn shop. But inside, something big is happening. The camera light blinks red. The video is already being shared. Within minutes, social media will explode with a story not about money, not about medals, but about respect. And Daniel? He has no idea that this moment is about to change everything. The world moves fast, but the internet moves faster. By the time Shaq and Daniel leave the pawn shop, the video is already circulating. Within hours, it's the top trending story across multiple platforms. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal steps in to save a struggling veteran. Comments flood in, shares skyrocket. People aren't just watching, they're feeling something. And when people feel something, they act. This veteran deserved better. Imagine serving your country, earning those medals, and then having to pawn them for rent. Salute to Shaq. This is how you respect those who served. The response is overwhelming. By midday, the pawn shop's Yelp and Google reviews plummet. Thousands of angry comments flood their pages. Shame on you for offering $50 for a man's honor. You disrespected a veteran on camera, and the whole world saw it. Some customers even show up in person, demanding the shop publicly apologize to Daniel. The young cashier, who had been so smug hours ago, now looks pale and rattled as his boss scolds him behind closed doors. But while the outrage spreads, something else happens. Something bigger. People start asking, how can we help? A well-known veteran support group sets up a GoFundMe page for Daniel, and within minutes, donations start rolling in. $500, $1,000, $5,000. Every time Daniel refreshes his phone, the number climbs higher. A single tweet from Shaq accelerates everything. No veteran should struggle. Let's take care of our own. Respect our heroes. That tweet alone sends the GoFundMe soaring past $100,000. News outlets pick up the story. TV stations reach out. Military pages repost it. Daniel, a man who had felt invisible just hours ago, is now the center of national attention. At first, he doesn't know how to react. He sits in his small apartment, staring at the screen in shock. His phone vibrates non-stop with notifications. He wipes his eyes. This is more than money. This is people telling him, you matter. He exhales deeply, a weight lifting off his chest. For the first time in years, he doesn't feel forgotten. And then, his phone rings. The caller ID is unknown. Daniel hesitates before answering. Hello? A firm, authoritative voice responds. Mr. Daniels, this is Colonel Hayes. We saw what happened today. Daniel straightens in his chair. We want to offer you a job, working with veterans like yourself. His breath catches in his throat. A job? He glances down at the medals in his lap, then back at the phone. Are you serious? A small chuckle from the other end. We don't make empty promises, soldier. Can you come in tomorrow? Daniel swallows hard, his mind racing. Just this morning, he was desperate, ready to part with his medals just to survive. Now, everything is about to change. Daniel's fingers tighten around the phone as he lifts it to his ear. His voice comes out hesitant, cautious. Hello? The line crackles for a moment before a deep, authoritative voice responds. Mr. Daniels, This is Colonel Hayes. Daniel sits up straighter, his pulse quickening. Colonel? That word alone carries weight, weight that pulls him out of his daze. We saw what happened. Daniel swallows hard. His mind races. Who's we? The military? Some veterans association? I, what do you mean? We saw the video, Daniel. The colonel's tone is calm but firm. And we want to help. Daniel's eyes dart to the medals resting on the table beside him. Just hours ago, he had been ready to part with them, to trade them for rent money, for survival. Now here he was, hearing a colonel say those words. We want to help. He clears his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. I appreciate that, sir, but no buts, Colonel Hayes interrupts. We have an opening in our Veterans Outreach Program. We help soldiers transition back into civilian life. We think you'd be a perfect fit. Daniel's heart pounds against his ribcage. A job? He grips the phone tighter. Are you serious? A small chuckle comes through the receiver. We don't make empty promises, soldier. We take care of our own. Daniel leans forward, his elbows resting on his knees. This morning he was counting pennies. Now he's being offered a position helping men and women like himself. Veterans who feel forgotten. So what do you say? The colonel asks. Daniel lets out a shaky breath. He wants to say yes immediately, but a part of him hesitates. He glances at Shaq, who's watching him closely, his massive frame relaxed, but his eyes sharp. Did you have something to do with this? Daniel asks, lowering the phone slightly. Shaq smirks, arms crossed. Maybe I made a call. Maybe I didn't. Daniel shakes his head in disbelief. Of course he did. For a long time, Daniel had felt invisible, like the world had moved on without him. This morning, he was standing in a pawn shop, ready to sell the very things that proved he mattered. Now, he had a choice. He could keep living day to day, scraping by, or he could step into something bigger. He presses the phone back to his ear. Where do I sign up? A satisfied chuckle comes through the phone. That's what I like to hear. Be at our office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Daniel nods, even though the colonel can't see him. I'll be there. As he hangs up, he exhales deeply, running a hand over his face. Shaq leans forward. You good? Daniel nods slowly. Yeah, I think I finally am. Shaq smirks, arms crossed as he watches Daniel process the phone call he just ended. Daniel's fingers tremble slightly as he sets his phone down, still trying to grasp what just happened. A job offer. A fresh start. It didn't seem real. His voice is hoarse when he finally speaks. You did this, didn't you? Shaq leans back against the counter, hands in his pockets, that same easy grin on his face. Maybe I made a call. Maybe I didn't. Daniel lets out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. You don't fool me, big guy. For a long moment, Daniel just stares at his medals, the ones he had been so ready to sell hours ago. He runs his fingers over the cool metal, the weight of them heavier than before. The shop around him feels different now. Earlier, it had felt like rock bottom, the last desperate stop before losing everything. Now it feels like a turning point. He wipes at his eyes, clearing his throat. I don't know how to thank you. Shaq shrugs like it's no big deal. Don't thank me, just pay it forward. Daniel's brows knit together. Pay it forward? Shaq nods. One day you're going to see someone who's struggling, like you were. And when that happens, you help them out. That's how it works. Daniel looks down, nodding slowly. The cashier, who had been watching silently, shifts uncomfortably behind the counter. His earlier arrogance is gone, replaced by something else. Regret. He clears his throat. Look, man, he says, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't mean to. Daniel holds up a hand. Don't worry about it. The customers who had been quietly watching break into applause. A woman near the entrance wipes away a tear. A man claps Daniel on the back. You deserve this, man, someone says. This is how you treat veterans, another person adds. Daniel shakes his head, overwhelmed. He never expected this reaction. Shaq chuckles. See? Told you. Respect is priceless. Shaq reaches into his pocket, pulls out something small, and presses it into Daniel's hand. Daniel looks down, confused. A gold coin. It's heavy and cool in his palm, and when he flips it over, he sees the engraving. Respect, honor, gratitude. He looks up at Shaq, speechless. Shaq gives him a wink. That's not for sale either. Daniel's throat tightens. He grips the coin, holding on to it like a promise. Daniel clutches his medals tightly, a silent vow forming in his heart. He will never let them go again. The newsroom is buzzing with energy. Screens flash, breaking headlines, and anchors shuffle their papers, preparing for the next big segment. Shaq strikes again! The news anchor's voice is lively, a grin spreading across her face. And this time, he changed a veteran's life. On the screen behind her, footage from the pawn shop plays. Daniel's teary-eyed gratitude, Shaq's casual generosity, the stunned silence of the cashier. The video had taken the world by storm. Social media is on fire. Oscar Shaq, the hero, is trending across Twitter. Facebook groups flood with reposts of the story. Instagram reels replay the moment Shaq placed that thick stack of cash on the counter, refusing to let Daniel part with his medals. The comments section is a wave of emotions. This broke my heart. No veteran should ever feel like they have to sell their medals just to survive. Shaq didn't just give this man money, he gave him dignity back. We need more people like this in the world. Within hours, the video climbs to millions of views. People from all walks of life, veterans, military families, everyday citizens, share their own stories of struggle. One story stands out among the thousands of comments. A woman named Lisa Carter posts, "My father was a Vietnam veteran. He died last year, still waiting on benefits that never came. Seeing Daniel's story broke me, but Shaq's kindness, that gave me hope." Her post garners thousands of reactions. More veterans chime in, sharing their experiences of being forgotten, of struggling to make ends meet after serving their country. This wasn't just a viral moment anymore. This was a movement. Then an unexpected message appears in Shaq's inbox. It's from the Wounded Warriors Project, a nonprofit dedicated to helping veterans in need. "Mr. O'Neal, we saw what you did for Daniel. We'd love to work with you to change more lives. Let's talk." Shaq's response? A simple thumbs-up emoji. Then he posts, "All right, y'all, let's make some real change. Who's with me? Respect our vets." Donations flood in. Within 24 hours, the organization raises over $500,000 to help struggling veterans. Meanwhile, Daniel starts his first day at his new job, helping fellow veterans transition back into civilian life. He walks into the office, still in disbelief. The colonel greets him with a firm handshake. "Welcome aboard, Daniel. You ready to change some lives?" Daniel smiles, the weight of his medals pressing gently against his chest. "More than ready, sir." Later that night, Shaq posts one last message before heading to bed. "Respect those who served, always." The post goes viral instantly. But Shaq? He just shuts off his phone and smiles, because he knows this isn't the end of the story. This is just the beginning. Daniel sits on his porch, the golden hues of the evening sun casting a warm glow over his small, weathered house. A gentle breeze rustles the leaves, carrying with it the distant laughter of children playing down the street. On the wooden table beside him, his medals gleam softly in the fading light. No longer hidden in a dusty box, no longer something he considered selling. They are exactly where they belong. With him. Daniel leans back in his old rocking chair, taking a deep breath. For the first time in years, he feels at peace. His rent is paid. His future is no longer uncertain. And for the first time in a long time, he no longer feels like a forgotten soldier. His eyes drift to the neatly stacked job training materials on the table. Guides on counseling, transition assistance, and veteran outreach. Tomorrow, he would officially start his new job, helping other veterans find their footing after service. A job he never saw coming. A job that was now his second chance. His gaze shifts to a framed photograph beside the medals. His old military unit, young and strong, arms draped over each other's shoulders, eyes filled with purpose. Some of them made it home. Some didn't. Daniel traces his fingers over the glass, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't give up, boys." The lump in his throat tightens. But this time, it isn't from defeat. It's from gratitude. They would be proud. A deep, rumbling engine pulls Daniel from his thoughts. He looks up just in time to see a black SUV rolling slowly past his house. Behind the wheel, a massive figure nods at him through the window, his signature grin flashing for just a moment before the car picks up speed and disappears down the road. Daniel chuckles, shaking his head. Even without a word, he knows. Shaq was just checking in. Daniel exhales, looking back at his medals. Honor isn't in what you sell, he murmurs to himself, gripping one of the medals between his fingers. It's in what you hold on to. And as the sun dips below the horizon, Daniel sits back, the weight on his shoulders finally gone, because he held on to the one thing that mattered most, his dignity.